but I can't read, I can't write, I can't spell, and most of the time I don't know my left from my right.
Now here's the thing about me that's a secret that most people don't know. I'm borderline retarded, and I can't read. These books that you're recommending, Goethe. I would pick that up and I would be like, 10 minutes later, I'd be like, what's my favorite song? The ABCs?
I think we're kind of getting off topic. Can you name 10 books?
Keep going back to me. Can you?
Don't change.
No.
10 books.
You're changing the subject, actually.
10 books.
You're changing the subject,
okay,
actually.
3 books.
Okay. Well, the Game of Thrones series,
not a book.
Twilight series. It is a book.
Dress your age. Carrying a school bag on stage. What you do with a school bag on stage? You can't even read.
Good evening. This one is going to go one of two ways. This one could end up being very, very enjoyable, or everyone's going to have a very bad time. Where's your money, Prude?
We'll see after this beer.
He's becoming cooler every stream, isn't he? He's got the talking gun. He's opening beers. He's going to be getting podcast head soon. It's going to be righteous.
I'm about to get married, Dimes. I was told that stops after the wedding ring goes on. I was learning from fellow podcasters like you.
I've never. I don't.
I've been injecting myself with like homemade TRT and taurine to avoid turning into a wife guy faggot.
Just let being a wife guy happen. First of all, second of all, I bet you got. I'm not Geo here. I'm not here telling all kinds of lurid stories about sex.
This may be the most meta show I do, where I reference the dirty laundry from all the other podcast appearances I do, which, to be perfectly honest with you, is quite enjoyable.
This is the certified digital archipelago struggle session. We take all the baggage, all the dirty laundry from that, and we work it out here.
And we condense a century of humiliation into a nice, compact 90 minutes.
What I like to do...
With a socialism that works.
I like to do couples therapy, but only invite one of the couple. So it's just therapy where one person complains about the other person.
It's therapy where one person gets to bitch.
Which really is couples therapy. I've never been, but it sounds like the therapist takes the side of one person and they just gang up on the other.
I don't like the guy who came up with this, in part just because, like, at the end of the day, I think he was one of the many psychic casualties of being sort of, the ordeal of civility experience Muslim edition. But, like, he had this guy, I think it's like Muhammad Yusuf or whatever, he had this great tweet where he had said something along the lines of, like, therapy is just like paying someone to convince you to become a libtard. And I very much agree with that sentiment. So that's couples therapy in a modern context, where it's just like, now I'm going to pay you $600 an hour until you talk like an NPR radio host.
Well, Prude, that wouldn't be me. I'd be something like the opposite. I'd be more of like a Joker type situation where my therapist is kind of like a hot bitch, and then I gaslight her into becoming a clown.
Isn't this this is just The Sopranos? This is just The Sopranos.
Okay, has anyone done Joker Tony Soprano? I feel like someone must have done this.
No, but I think it should happen.
It's right there.
It really is. I mean, there's so much media that I think can be reworked to be very right-wing or chud-coded. Like, I mean, after yesterday's Smiling Friends episode, I think has defined itself as the show of the 2020s, because no one else is going to do a Smurfs parody where the evil wizard is killing Smurfs to correct his Norwood 4. Just explicitly mention the Norwood scale on a TV show. So I think it's fine. I think you can make it work. I want Joker Tony Soprano. I want Joker like Candace Owens.
Everyone works as a Joker. I'm just laughing at Tony Soprano like chain smoking, going, "You wouldn't fucking get it." All right,
you wouldn't get it.
Yeah, you wouldn't get it. Okay. Now my mind's just populating all the side characters. Where's Syl going? Where's Polly going? Who's Christopher? He's got to be the guy he stabs, right?
Well, we were doing this on the show the other week, where I was just doing Joker impressions, talking about just $7,000 checks.
Guys, Joker's still funny. I know people think it's like Sneed and Sneed's over. Joker's not over. Sneed's out. Sneed might come back.
I don't think it's out either. Well, I mean, parts of it probably is, but I would like to remind the audience that some idiot today, and not some idiot, I would say this guy is an artist, had done a steamed hams meme in the year of our Lord 2025, and he did it as a My Dinner with Andre parody, and it lasts 45 minutes.
I tell you what, steamed hams has ridden the line. It hasn't overstayed its welcome. Not really. I welcome a steamed hams riff. See, you can tell everyone we're going to great lengths to not discuss this book.
So for the Blood Satellite fans out there, you notice every time the Dimes brings up interesting literature, you can tell that Judas gives no shits and does not care because A, he probably didn't read the book, and he doesn't find this particularly interesting enough to read, or it's a conclusion he already reached, 5 years ago on his political journey. There's more times where yeah, this guy that's taking off.
Sorry, is your audio cutting? I don't know if it's cutting out just for me, but your audio is kind of getting muffled there. If anyone else can...
let's find out. Let's find out.
Sounds better now.
Okay, well we'll leave it as that. But yeah, it's I find it funny that Judas will be, oh yeah, the government or the FBI works undercover to contract with pedophiles and stuff like that, and it's just I don't need to read this book. I already came to that conclusion 5 years ago. It's good to this is one of those books where I'm not here for it, and I'm going to be Judas this week.
We got Dormant Vision in the chat saying, I actually read this one myself about a year ago. Will be cool to see what you fellas have to say. I'm reminded that real people have read a book like this. The book we are talking about is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. I'll throw that up on the screen in just a moment. But the question obviously arises, what drove me to want to recommend this? Because this was me. This was my idea. And I said, Prude, we gotta do it. And my reasons are fewfold. The first is that I encountered someone on X, I believe it was a black influencer of some kind, and he posted this book and he said, message to all the young black men out there, stay away from this book. This book is responsible for more people getting trapped within the Marxist framework than any other, especially mainly for black people. So I saw that. And then on our last episode, we had covered The Hour of Decision by Oswald Spengler. And so much of that is about, I believe he terms it the color revolution.
You had the white world revolutions and the colored world revolutions.
Yeah, and so this book seemed to be a good representation of the colored world revolution. And it's not just Western Marxism, because so much leftist theory is written by white guys or Jews, but we don't have a lot of exposure to something that's just written by an African that deals with those ideas. And even the last book we covered, Like This, White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, that's just a white lady. So I said, I want to hear Marxist revolution from the perspective of the third world. And this was written in the 70s.
1972.
Yeah. So the third reason I did was because I also encountered some other discourse out there where there's just, again, some young black revolutionary woman, Palestine flag, raised fist, all the stuff in her name and bio. And she was posting that Europe didn't underdevelop Africa. Europe raped Africa. So it occurred to me that even something like this title seems quaint. It seems quaint compared to what we're seeing now. Because the title, How We Underdeveloped Africa, and we'll get to this in just a moment, there is the subtle implication that Africa was developed by Europeans. It just wasn't developed enough. And so there's perhaps a materialistic solution to this, and you detect that all throughout the book, where it's just Africa was kind of suppressed, but it's on the right path, and maybe if we just had a bit more money, then we could get there. But the discourse I'm seeing right now, it just rejects that entirely. It's just, you raped Africa, so we get to rape you now. So this might not even this pales in comparison to what you see from intellectuals currently. And I love to hear some of your maybe initial thoughts on the book.
So, in a lot of ways, like our friend Dave Green, I don't do this on main, but I have an alt account, or at least an alternate like Gmail login in which I browse a lot of Marxist YouTube and sort of what are progressives and liberals talking about these days. And Walter Rodney is not mentioned by very many people anymore, which I find particularly interesting. There's always this emphasis on Franz Fanon or other writers when it comes to the issue of imperialism and colonialism, but Walter Rodney not so much, which I find really interesting considering Walter Rodney's history. He was from British Guiana, born in 1942. He would die from a car bomb in 1980. He was less than 40 years old. And, he had spent a lot of time writing on the history of Africa as well as the African slave trade in the Guinea coast. And then later, this would be the book that he's, famous for after his death. He's got a foundation and everything like that. Went to university in Tanzania, became an associate professor there before returning to Guyana. But he was a Pan-Africanist, which I think is a particularly interesting thing to consider, because that is sort of something that I don't think gets mentioned a lot these days outside of the African Union or the sort of the claims about bringing Africa as a united power. Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. But anyways, like I mentioned all these things because the way that he meets his end is particularly interesting. He had written numerous works and letters about tribalism and the early post-colonial leadership at the time. He had used the word negritude in one of those letters, which I find particularly interesting. On top of all
that's
that,
got to come back. By the way, I want to see that.
It would be certainly interesting. It's a framework of critique from. You don't really get to see that a lot anymore. But anyways, he's killed in a car bomb. This is after he had returned, celebrating the independence of Zimbabwe. Allegedly, he said that someone from the Guyana Defense Force, a member of a Hebrew Israelite community, had led to the explosive that killed him. Others had said that he was eventually just going to die from bloodshed and violence anyways in the midst of revolutionary fervor. So there's a lot of things that remain
Can I also say
unknown.
There was, and this is just briefly mentioned on Wikipedia, and we don't trust Wikipedia, of course, but there was a claim made by someone close to him that a day or two prior, Walter Rodney had also approached some people looking for bomb-making equipment. He was making a bomb. So there is a possibility that he blew himself up by accident.
Oh, like a Jack Parsons accident.
Yeah. So
with a giant asterisk.
No matter what, he blew himself up, or what they believe is most likely was the president of Guyana at the time
ordered his execution.
Lyndon Forbes Burnham. But the ultimate irony, of course, is that Burnham was himself a socialist. He's classified as a strongman socialist, of course, but I mean, most socialist revolutionaries would be, right? Especially in Africa. Like, is there a non-strongman politician in Africa? It's the guy with like the biggest sash on that just wins the election. Like, who the fuck? What are you talking about? This isn't real. This isn't a real continent, So, but the idea was that even within this revolutionary socialist paradigm that he inhabited, he was still seen as too far left or too much of a troublesome agitator to survive. Because there's stories of Walter Rodney, he was going out in the fucking hinterlands in Africa, going to tribes and stuff, and trying to give speeches to them and teach them Marxist dialectical theory, which is very funny. Like, I'm just, I got my prejudices. I assume these people have bones in their noses and they're clicking and clacking around. And then there's this guy. I mean, Walter Rodney, you see him, he looks like a fucking conscious rapper from New York these days. So he's probably out there rubbing two sticks together, trying to make it work. Good on him. Someone's got to do it. Someone's got to teach Marx to these fucking tribes, right? And why not him? And so, but then he got blown to smithereens for it. And his, I guess amongst black radicals, they still traffic in his books. It just got re-released. We have an older copy, of course. sorry, I got Stackademic Slagent. It says, asterisk, I see why we're already in the Ebonic mindset. Oh man.
There's an asking a question joke there that I'm going to refrain from making. I'm the same one that we did with like white fragility. I don't want to turn the entire stream into a glorified shitpost that will eventually be written up in some SPLC report when Dimes and I are eventually like doxxed. But the text itself, it was so for instance, like I'm probably not going to mention HBD as much as perhaps Dimes will, or in part because I think that this is much more interesting to examine without perhaps going to the bell curve or the statistics of IQ or other things there. And also there's a lot of history in here that I think is selectively chosen. So when reading the text, there are things that, of course, there are parts of Africa that, of course, were developed. There were trade routes and what I guess you could call empire in the Western understanding of the term. But also at the same time, I think that so much of what gets written in this text is a bundle of contradictions for what gets considered capitalist and what is considered either command economy or feudal pre-capitalistic structures of trade and market economy. So it becomes really frustrating because Rodney will use a definition for capitalism, but will not apply it towards the continent utilizing what we would probably call capitalism. Instead, we're now using capitalism as a particular form of just like saying this is the European style of market economy, and that's all that it's going to be about, and then focusing heavily on exploitation, despite the fact that I think that there were numerous structural and geographic, and this is where you get all the Jared Diamond guns, germs, and steel shit, but like there are plenty of environmental and geographic factors that would limit development, and then Rodney doesn't really mention those a lot, which is frustrating, except for one section, and I think that's his CYA, but that's about it. This book it's interesting to read. It's not one that gets mentioned a lot by a lot of Marxist or progressive circles these days, especially when I think nowadays, when we talk about Africa in sort of the global political sense, it is almost explicitly tribal or racial, and it's never within the framework of Marxism or Leninism, and when it is mentioned in Marxist-Leninist terms, it's really just doing the legwork, ideologically speaking, to cover for racial and tribal tendencies.
Oh, of course. And you had mentioned that this book is a bundle of sticks of contradictions, and that's the magic of it. I love books like this. I love books that across chapters contradict themselves so starkly. So just one off the top of my head, I know we're going to get to this at some point, but he makes a few claims in this. The first is that before European contact, slavery did not exist in Africa. And then later on, he has to admit that, of course, slavery existed, but it was different because slavery minus capitalism is just better. It's like, so he gives examples because he has to. And that I give him some credit for just not entirely making up history, which is what you would see now. If you go to a lot of black radicals online, they're just talking about sort of a Marvel movie version of Africa. But here you actually have an African having in some way to come to terms with the fact that, okay, we had slavery, but here's the thing, it wasn't capitalistic because that's a Western thing. So he said, we didn't have, rape. We would just go to other villages and bonk the women on the head to go find wives. You say, okay. Or it's like we had slavery, but we took them and they worked and they were part of the family, And, so of course he has to admit that it was. And then the third claim, he builds off of that. And this is the most outrageous, and I love it. It's that you wouldn't have any European development without the transatlantic slave trade, which isn't to say that Africans were directly responsible, but the fact that Europeans built it was the fact that they made the slave trade to build the ships so big, and because they built ships so big, then they could travel farther and discover the new world and things like that. So he's trying to give credit to African slaves for developing Europe. Because, and this is what I love about this brand I'm going to use the term third worldist throughout this. Some people reject its usage. They think that's just propagandistic. But I do believe third worldism exists, especially within leftist political theory. But, there's this idea that they cannot really divorce their philosophy from their ego. It's like talking with Indians on X. So it's very difficult for him to make the claim that Africans are an oppressed people because that's humiliating. That makes them seem weak. So he'll present you with two things. That we could have been Wakanda. In fact, he doesn't use that language, but we were a great people. We were an amazing people, and we were just randomly taken advantage of. But they can never be fully oppressed. They need to be oppressed greatness. And I think that's one aspect that's mutated into the current discourse we see right now. But that's all throughout the book. He wants to tell you a sob story about Africa, but he just can't. There's a block there. So if you have any thoughts on that, because I can go into the notes right here.
Well, you have more notes than I do for this text. I think that at the same time that there's I think the work has a very difficult time. I think, however, to give Rodney some credit, which is the only time I will do this, I think from a writing perspective, he does a good job at trying to walk a fine line between we have been conquered and held back by a other, i.e. Europeans, but also at the same time, we were something of a parity power or having the potential to do so, which, while I find that to be interesting, considering how massive Africa is, and to simply say African development is very it's a very catch-all term, and they even say European is a catch-all development because the technological development of, say, the Greeks during the Industrial Revolution is nothing in comparison to that of Germany, France, or Britain. And so even though they're technically on the European continent, right? And so the same thing happens there. Rodney does do a half-decent job of trying to make sure that there are explicit references to tribes, empires, groups, or kingdoms that had taken place throughout the centuries prior to European colonization. The text itself, however, does, I think, find itself in a weird position where it wants to say, we were going to be something great, and we still have the capacity to be something great, but we also have to thank things like the European slave trade, and that the Europeans are the ones who invented this divide and conquer tactic of race and tribe, even though ironically, is like people like Frantz Fanon and others will claim, that like, oh, well, now the new leaders just try and reenact the system of the oppressors, when, a lot of this is stuff that had been there even prior to the Europeans arriving. And European reports of early ventures into various parts of Africa tend to indicate that there had been, various hierarchies or rulings or basically power structures and dynamics based entirely off of region or what we might say race or tribe.
Yeah, if you practice high-level racism, you'll understand that there's a strata to Africa, that there's sections of Africa. Usually Ethiopia is brought up as a great example of a more developed region of Africa. Of course, you have Northern Africa, which scarcely resembles the rest of Africa because you've got Libya, you've got these other places, and then right as you get to the center of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, even, it gets worse and worse until you're in the Congo, which might as well be another fucking planet. But of course, there's areas of Africa where civilization historically, in the ancient realm even, have risen. And that's why, that's how the slave trade could happen, because you had these regions that were capable of trade and commerce. They couldn't be 100% taken advantage of. And again, like I was saying before, that's where I give Walter Rodney some credit, because he's at least trying to have one foot in reality. Whereas if you discuss anything like this now with any black radical, they're working just from complete fantasy. Like it's just made up. It's been so immersed into like Nation of Islam style, debating that it's made up. It's imagined. There's so much imagination. We're at least here. He's trying to point to valid historical sources, but I've got a few headings here that will kind of form the buckets of what we'll be talking about. So I've got economic history of underdevelopment. I've got accounts of Africa. That's a fun one. Discussion of Marxist analysis, because Marxism features very prominently in this. And the last one being blaming Europe for development. So we're going to traipse through this. We're going to do a hop, skip, and a jump. We're going to have some fun. We'll do some reading. And we can measure the level of Prudentialists' disgust throughout. Because I think I had a more fun time reading this. And I also want to actually, before I go, there is a comment here from Randall Shirker, says, trust and believe there's ever more coal books than this. Mike Davis's late Victorian Holocausts lifted a much better thesis to make a very similar book to the current one being discussed. So that's good news for me that there's worse books out there. For listeners,
they will be read.
For listeners and our fans, which we call the illiterate, if you got worse books, send them our way.
Remember, this is the only pro-illiteracy podcast on the internet.
I don't want to see any of my niggas reading. A pendulum says there's a catalog of AI pictures that debunk this book.
Oh man, that's a fun one. Because I have noticed that where people will post and they'll be like, this was the royal family in 1850, what happened? And it's a clearly AI generated image of a black family in like European, aristocratic attire. And I don't think people, I mean, this is where I think a lot of AI accelerationists do it for racist reasons. So they're like, I think if we can generate enough AI porn or we can crash the TFR of certain regions. And so it's Margaret Sanger, but with like Palantir money,
This is a fun thing to do, is to try and trick all these people with AI images, but what is to be gained?
I don't think there's anything, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't think there's anything to be gained, because as our screen usage continues to increase, I think that cultivation theory will continue to be a very prominent form of basically enculturation. We cultivate the world around us by our media consumption, and we think that it is somewhat of a reflection of the real world. This is why the average American thinks, according to like the Pew Research Center, that like 1 in 5 people are gay or lesbian, and that like the country is like 40% black, which is not true. I mean, blacks have stayed at a pretty steady minority population in the U.S. for a long time, but also like 1 in 5 people in America are not LGBT or whatever. But like because of TV and social media and the barrage of propaganda out of Hollywood, like you certainly think that that's the case. And so if you tell a lot of people who come here or are shipped in deliberately by the American government or whatever, that the world is actually, every place was full of black people, and then like the evil Yakubian creation destroyed the world, like that's only going to perpetuate resentment and more ethnic hostility, which I think to some extent is deliberately designed. But it does come to show that I think when you have books like these, and you combine it with sort of this Wakanda-esque, and I'm using that word, I know, this Wakanda-esque propaganda machine that you can literally prompt your own fantasy world, that I don't think that's good for people like you and me.
Yeah, because we're just feeding that machine. Because I remember when the bit that we were all going to do was making that okay sign be a white supremacist symbol to trick the media, because it's obviously not, right? And then we all did that, and then people just get thrown in jail for it. You know what I mean? So it's like, yeah, we can make all these fake images that totally undercut European history, but then they will believe it, and then then it's just going to be used against you. They don't fucking care. Like we're presenting the most irritating weapons to our opponents. So it's just for us. And I guess the game would be, how outlandish could you make these images? Like there's Neil Armstrong. He's black and he's landing on the moon, which is also black. It's just a black man landing on a black man's head. They're like, I knew it. A new school lied to me. All right. Here we I'm at page 161 here. I like this part. It says, because he has to set up, the definitions of capitalism.
I will say this. This is the PDF is like 300 some odd pages. This book is remarkably easy and very clear to read because this reads like an academic text where there is very clear introduction, body, and conclusion, like subheadings. This is a very easy text to read.
Yeah, you notice that too, right? Like he'll end it. He kind of wrote it like you would write a high school essay, where it's like state what you're going to say, then state it, and then restate the thesis at the end. So like every chapter has there's a section, maybe I'll just scroll through, which is like notes on how to read the previous section, where he just kind of adds
all there, yeah.
Yeah, which I've never seen that before because it's not written in a very dense way at all. But he says here, in the centuries before colonial rule, Europe increased its economic capacity by leaps and bounds, while Africa appeared to have been almost static. Africa in the late 19th century could still be described as part communal and part feudal, although Western Europe had moved completely from feudalism to capitalism. I mean, depends if you ask Marxists, they would tell you it's still pretty feudal, but whatever.
Yeah.
To elucidate the main thesis, kind of a miss on his part, whatever. To elucidate the main thesis of the study, it's necessary to follow not only the development of Europe and the underdevelopment of Africa, but also understand how those two combined in a single system, that of capitalist imperialism. So I'm just going to start with that. That's a good step. I'm going to go to page 30 here. I believe it's here. Okay. Where he says, every people have shown a capacity for independently increasing their ability to live a more satisfactory life through exploiting their resources in nature. Hey, fair enough. Every continent independently participated in the early epochs of the extension of man's control over his environment, which means, in effect, that every continent can point to a period of economic development. As an aside, this is something I've read quite a few Marxist and leftist thinkers as they don't have much interest in ancient history. Have you noticed that? Like their interest in history seems to go almost even stop at the Middle Ages. But when you make a claim like that, like every continent pretty much developed along the same way. Like no, it didn't. Do you know anything about China? Do you know anything about Mongolia? Do you know anything about the Aztecs? You know what I mean? Like there's actually...
we seem to skip over most of like the early river valley civilizations, and then we discuss these like ancient kingdoms, and then there's this weird pause. And I think in part, I don't know, for instance, I don't know enough, and I'm curious in a morbid fashion of like, ooh, that sounds interesting. Like when you go down a weird Wikipedia rabbit hole, and then all of a sudden you're like reading about like the Lazarus reflex and so anyways, like for me it would be really interesting to see how like a Walter Rodney character or a Pan-Africanist would look at Islam, for example, because as much as a lot of American black writers would look at Christianity, for instance, as an explicitly white man's religion, despite its origins, I'm very curious to see how Islam gets integrated into that, because when we talk about a lot of African rule or development over parts of the African continent, you can't ignore the sort of tower that is the impact that Islamic empires had, especially in North Africa, which was already vastly different because of, you have the Copts, for example, and a much more lighter skinned peoples, and, centuries of like Greeks and Romans, etc., being an influence there. But also now, we talk about development. It's just like, well, what does that mean? And so, for instance, like Rodney on this page, this is a note I did have where he talks about development. And I'm just going to read the top section here. He says, more often than not, the term development is used in an exclusive economic sense, the justification being that type of economy is itself an index of other social features. What then is economic development? A society develops economically as its members increase jointly in their capacity for dealing with the environment. This capacity for dealing with the environment is dependent on the extent to which they understand the laws of nature, science, on the extent to which they can put that understanding into practice by devising tools, technology, and on the manner in which that work is organized. Taking a long-term view, it can be said that there has been constant economic development within human society since the origins of man, because man has multiplied enormously in his capacity to win a living from nature. The magnitude of man's achievement is best understood by reflecting on the early history of human society and noting the following. Firstly, the progress from crude stone tools, the use of metals, the changeover from hunting and gathering wild fruit to the domestication of animals and growing crops. And thirdly, the improvement of organization of work from being individualistic activity to which towards an activity that assumes a social character through the participation of many. Kind of vague, are very rudimentary and basic. I think that jointly is an interesting turn of phrase, but basically, like, man has developed into being a smaller family unit into large complex societies, which I guess is fine.
Yeah, like he gets into this in the book when he's trying to explain, okay, what is communalism? What is feudalism?
What is capitalism?
Yeah,
a lot of time on that.
He describes these all as steps on a ladder. And once you understand that's how these people view development, it's not dissimilar to the upward line of history, the end of history, or progress, universal progress, thinking that this is just a ladder that we all get to climb, and for some reason some have been allowed to climb it higher. We just must be permitted to climb up, help us climb the ladder further, which is a very reductive way of looking at it. But if you do look at it that way, that makes sense. But again, this is written in the 70s, so I would love to see how someone like Walter Rodney would fine-tune their thesis, given the fact that Africa has been the recipient of billions upon billions of international aid. I mean, name something that Africa hasn't gotten for fucking free, right? So it's like it turns out that you can't just pour money over this problem. It turns out, and this isn't discussed in the book, but this is my thesis, and I'll just get it out at the start because I don't know how long we're actually going to spend on this book. But all development is imperialism by his definition, and in fact by all our definitions. Because consider what a benevolent nation would have to do, a benevolent civilization. And I would make the argument that America would fit that description, and many of the Western countries now. But let's just imagine the perfect benevolent nation. How would you fix Africa? So, and he gets into this later in the book, and we'll probably read that part soon, but you would actually need to go in, and you can't just give them money, of course, because perhaps there's corrupt leaders. And they don't just want free money, they also want education. That's what he gets into in this book. It's like, you need to give us the tools to succeed ourselves. Okay, what are those tools? Well, that's education. You have to give us the tools, then teach us how to use them, because one thing he complains about is, because he has to admit that the Europeans showed up and traded them advanced manufacturers. They gave them guns, they gave them tools, they gave them finer materials than they had previously. But what do they do with them? Well, they probably bashed them into a bunch of pieces and made a fucking hat out of it. So they said, well, you need to teach us to not do that. It was an injustice that you did not give us more instruction manuals and teach us how to fully exploit these tools. So what they want is schools. Okay, how is that not imperialism? Because you get schools and he says, well, now you're teaching us math, now you're teaching us fucking English, now you're teaching us geography, giving us names to the fucking borders. What? Like he takes exception to that Europeans actually did go in and build roads and schools and dig wells, whatever it might be. And he's more upset that the schools that Europeans did build and the roads that led to those schools did not have the correct signs on the roads, and they did not teach their specific, nuanced verbal history, whatever it is. So there's actually nothing you can do for these people that wouldn't be counted as imperialism. You can, and if you ever try, that will be used against you at a later fucking date.
And very specifically, like the point of imperialism for Rodney is in the classical sort of Marxist sense that, for one, workers and peasants are the most dynamic force in world history and human development, and will probably usher in the Marxist interpretation of the end of history. But more importantly, as Rodney notes later on, I think it's in like the next 2 pages or so, that imperialism is a logical phase of capitalism, and that really we have to understand that in this sense we have to consider the usual points about like economic development is, I think, way too narrow, And instead, we have to look at the totality when it comes to production, land, population, technology, specialization, production. And so when we look at the comparisons of, say, socialism, which has taken hold in sort of what he calls the weaker areas of like capitalist democracy, the exploited, the downtrodden, and the worker, that we have to understand that, when we talk about, when like the West or Europeans or capitalists talk about development, they don't consider these factors. Whereas socialism and his particular study, which is basically from pre-colonial era until 1950, where his studies end, is that underdevelopment is, not the absence of development, but we have to consider that there is a dynamic in place that has stopped that development, not just economic, but also culture or capital or technology or social organization. And for Rodney, that's the, logical understanding of capitalism in his worldview, which is imperialism.
Yeah, he gets into it more here. I'm just skip to page 15. He says, at the social and cultural level, there are many features which aid in keeping underdeveloped countries integrated into the capitalist system and at the same time hanging on to the apron strings of the metropoles. The Christian church has always been a major instrument for cultural penetration and cultural dominance, in spite of the fact that in many instances, Africans sought to set up independent churches. Now, I love that line. It's like the church has been used to propagandize us, even though many Africans just start their own churches. Well, okay, you can't just say that. You can't just say it's one way, but then it's also another. You see what I'm saying? And also, he gets into this segment right here where he says, like, everything the West could ever possibly do would be polluted by capitalism. There actually is nothing that... There's no amount of money you could give. There's no amount of technology you could give. If you gave them a food replicator that teleported food into their fucking bellies, the bellies of starving children, they would say that food is toxic because it came from a capitalist system and made them dependent upon the West. You see, which actually is true. Like, the only solution would be to just go hands off entirely. We will restrict capitalism from ever broaching your shores and will leave you alone forever. I think that's a fair agreement, right? He continues on here. And one thing he mentions in here before I forget, maybe you'll recall this. I noticed this with a lot of third worldists, is they hate the Pope. And they seem to think the Pope controls all of Europe. Did you see that in this?
There were definitely some anti-papist sentiments throughout the text, yes.
I'm not saying this as a Catholic, but just the idea that for a lot of these sorts of Marxist revolutionary types, they think the Pope is like the king of Europe, even now. And like the Pope runs the Bank of England, the Bank of England runs America, all kinds of kooky stuff, but it's always specifically the Catholic Church and the Pope. And he gets into here, he says, the Christian Church has always been a major instrument for cultural penetration. Equally important has been the role of education in producing Africans to service the capitalist system and to subscribe to its values. Recently, the imperialists have been using new universities in Africa to keep themselves entrenched at the highest academic level. So they're not only building schools to teach kids how not to eat dirt, the capitalists are building universities, but they're not teaching African things. I'm like, well, then you would remain static, would you not? You will not permit a building that teaches development because, of course, it's the white man's development. Well, what is the black man's development? He gets into that here later. I'm going to see if I can find it in my notes real quick. But it was so great. Later on, he's like, well, they say that the West is so advanced in manufacturing. Well, Webster's defines manufacturing as, like, honestly, he goes and tries to say, well, manufacturing is really just something you make, right? So Africans were making things for thousands of years. And he talks about there's a wooden spoon that we found. Like, shut the fuck up. You know what you mean by manufacturing, asshole. You weren't smelting steel. Can we agree? No. Well, no. We kind of made bird masks. Did you? Well, you were the American Indians made better bird masks than you did. What do you think about that? And they also think the world's on the back of a giant turtle. What do you think about that? You're worse than those motherfuckers.
Yeah, Rodney talks about sort of underdevelopment as paradox. He this is page 45 on the PDF. It's the last section here. Speaking of Christianity, he says, in a way, underdevelopment is a paradox. Many parts of the world that are naturally rich are actually poor, and parts that are not so well off in wealth of soil and subsoil are enjoying the highest standards of living. When the capitalists from the developed parts of the world try to explain this paradox, they often make it sound as if it is something God-given about the situation. One bourgeois economist in a book on development accepted that the comparative statistics of the world today show a gap that is much larger than it was before. By his own admission, the gap between the developed and underdeveloped countries have increased by at least 15 to 20 times over the last 150 years. However, the bourgeois economist in question does not give a historical explanation, nor does he consider that there is a relationship of exploitation which has allowed capitalist parasites, to grow fat and impoverish the dependencies. Instead, he puts forward a biblical explanation. He says, all is told in the Bible, for unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance, but unto him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath, from St. Matthew. In the gospel. Presumably, the only comment one can make on that is amen. The interpretation that underdevelopment is somehow ordained by God emphasized of the racist trend in European scholarship. It is in line with racist prejudice to say openly or to imply that their countries are more developed because their people are innately superior, and that they are and that the responsibility for the economic backwardsness of Africa lies in the generic backwardness of the race of Black Africans.
Do you notice that within just that segment there, it's if you really try and just close your eyes and listen, it's completely fucking incoherent. Like, there's no reason to even mention God in there, unless to say that Europeans are lying about the truth of the matter, which is what, because he says here, okay, many parts of the world that are naturally rich are actually poor, and parts that are not so well off in wealth or soil, subsoil enjoy the highest standards of living. Yeah, what that means is Europeans looked at you and said, how come you're not more advanced? You have everything here. You got so much shit all over the fucking floor. You're rich in resources. Why have you not utilized these resources? So they'll say to themselves, I guess God just favors us. When in reality, what they want to say is, wow, there's too many nincompoops over here who don't know how to do anything. That's it. And then he has this little detour in the middle about God, but then he gets to it at the end, which is that, well, you can't just, it's just racist to say one is more innately superior to the other. Then what's your solution? What actually is your solution? Because you just pointed to prehistory saying that everyone was developing independently. And it's not true to say that Europe only developed after contact with Africa. So what drove that independent development, you stupid asshole? You know, you shouldn't get wound up like I am reading this right now, but it frustrates me when I see someone who is lauded, someone who's taken seriously, and within a single paragraph, they can't keep their own fucking mind right. Or they're used to just being slippery with their language. And that's what I don't like about a lot of leftist writers. They're very slippery with their terminology. They'll try and take you on these little detours, try these little rhetorical sleights of hand to make it seem like they're actually fucking saying anything. It's like, no, you actually gave me an exactly perfect reason right there why one group appears to be superior to the other. If not, then give me another fucking reason. There's not one in this book. Sorry, I'm getting all hot. I'm getting all steamy over here. I'm pissed off.
Getting a little sweaty there, buddy. No, I mean, I think that there's a lot of examples of contradictory language in the text that I think we can definitely spend a lot of time exploring, especially because one, definitions are not going to match what you and I would traditionally call.
Can I just interrupt you and point at this so before I forget it?
Yeah.
Pac-Man Respector says, don't all these arguments fall apart when you look at many Asian countries who developed impressive industries despite poor regional material richness? And this is actually true. That's what's remarkable, not only of Japan, which territorially is a very strange small island, but also China. China struggles a lot in producing food. You would think that due to such a large landmass, it could be rich in farmable terrain, and it's really not. It can pretty much only make rice. That's why they eat so much rice. That's not just a racist joke. It is true, but they made do. they may do with the lack of resources. Of course, they didn't give anything shit about rare earth metals back then all throughout history, but especially in the Irish figured it out. How the fuck did the Irish figure it out? They're basically Africans.
That may be the most Anglo thing you've said today.
I'm trying to reaffirm my whiteness in this, so I'm going straight for the jugular of the Irish, of course.
Well, and that's the other thing too is that there were great degrees of no contact between various Asian empires and groups like the Chinese, who we have the very famous images of like what some of their ships look like in compared to Christopher Columbus's, and I mean how accurate those representations may be is a whole other story, but it does kind of come to show that like actually the world that you and I know that we didn't have a lot of contact with back then is certainly capable of their own development, their own wars, and their own, histories and literature and things that I think a lot of many Anglo-Orientalists and anthropologists at the time took a great degree of interest in. One, because they didn't know anything about it, but two, it was also a whole different group of people that had areas of development or advances that were not known to us, and to a point where I still think it's a large cultural affectation, whether it be Eastern religion or Eastern medicine, and things that we don't pay as much attention to, or perhaps we didn't. And I mean, it's the same thing with our own relationship to, say, the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, and being so grateful to the Crusades opening up trade routes. But it's like a lot of these things did exist prior. It's just the awkward conversation to have about, there was the Byzantine Empire and then Islam and everything else. So like it becomes this weird relationship that we have with our own history that I don't think we get enough discussion over. And it becomes very difficult, I think, like unless you know these things, like good luck having any coherent conversation with anybody, not just someone like Walter Rodney, but even like the average Western historian. Like it's just not something that gets to be talked about.
Do you think that's changing? Do you think that the lines of communication are opening up where we can discuss this stuff again?
I would hope so, but I also think that unfortunately because of immigration, no.
Interesting. I guess it would depend what is being discussed, of course, because it's due to immigration that we've got so much open pushback against Israel lately, because because so many non-whites are doing it. It's become acceptable, I suppose.
Well, I mean, this is the thing, though, is that you'll hear a lot of claims that are made where it's primarily because of things like imperialism is like the go-to boogeyman on those issues, where it's like this is the reason why we're not doing so well, or this is the reason why it's bad because Israel is an imperialist country, which I think in a lot of ways you could say, yeah, it's imperialist. It certainly has imperialist tendencies or whatever. Like you can make that argument, sure. Like it's one we can entertain and discuss. Maybe not here, obviously, but in a lot of ways, I think with Rodney, he's providing an ideological mask of sorts to cover for. I think in a lot of ways, just I don't want to say it boils down to just pure resentment, but I think in many facets of this discussion, it is just resentment, because what else is it going to be other than, we have a world where like, yeah, it is resource rich, but also at the same time, I'm not saying it, for instance, but like with the famous 2011 documentary, like what is it, Empire of Dust, or the one where we get the "It's so tiresome" meme,
It's Empire of Dust, yeah.
Empire of Dust, right? And so it's like, okay, well, that it's the Chinese guy making the same sort of complaints that you and I would be called racists for if we were to ever say them publicly, even though I think it's somewhat obvious that he's dealing with people that don't want to work or sell different types of gravel, and it's inferior, et cetera, and it's just like so. It boils down to some basic questions. And I mean, I think this is the big complication of all sorts of like quote unquote, imperialism studies or studies of colonialism is that how much of the forbidden no areas of political discourse, i.e. things like human biodiversity or conversations about the innate historical and political development of Africa that we're not supposed to discuss, that prevents us from being honest in these conversations. And I think that sort of becomes the big bugaboo that Rodney and others aren't going to talk about, because it's just like, well, we can't say those things, even though a lot of other Black writers have said things about this issue. And it's like, well, I guess we're going to just kind of be stuck dancing around like economic or historical arguments that are often so biased or clouded by resentment or the sentiment that I've been conquered by the other. Like, what am I even doing here?
Yeah, you mentioned something very poignant there, which was the resentments. I think that's important when discussing the third worldist expression of Marxist theory, because it's only in the West, in Europe, in America, you would get someone like a Mark Fisher, author of Capitalist Realism, or any of the more interesting Marxist thinkers. Baudrillard would be one example. But these nations are not producing a Baudrillard. They're producing anti-imperialists. And so I think, as you were kind of pointing to right there, I think Marxism provides a nice faceplate, a nice academic gussying up to what is just naked identity-based resentment. That's it. So it's, if you take these courses, these sort of Black activist courses, it's anti-imperialist. Anti-imperialist sounds good. It sounds legitimate, but it's just anti-whiteness. And so it's just a strategy to attack the white superstructure, the white paradigm, the white status quo, whatever they would term it. But that's it. There's no actual economic theory there. Of course there's not. Have you talked to these people? They don't give a shit about a crisis within modernity. This is all the stuff that we talk about. They're just using this as a fucking cloak for what it's always been, which is just various 50 shades of Camp of the Saints. So we got some good comments going on here. I got one again from Pac-Man. This reminds me a lot of the Djinn-brained Twitter post, but the genie is just the existence of the West. The darkness of Africa is because of what we did, and we didn't do something we should have. And again, if you talk to a lot of them now, as they find greater numbers in these nations, they will admit that this is just revenge. This is revenge for imperialism, and imperialism is so ill-defined. Even in this book, it's pretty ill-defined. There's no tables of dollars and cents. I encounter this all the time.
There are tables in here, but they're not. How accurate they may be or what present studies we have is a whole other discussion. But there are some things on here that talk about the general wealth of a particular country, and how many dollars a person makes per capita. It's interesting, but nevertheless, it is sort of baked down to, well, why aren't we rich like you?
Yeah, because he'll say good point, and he'll say, look, you trade this resource here. The minimum wage in Britain will be 30 cents, and over here we're making 5 cents, something like that. And prior to that, they were making 0 cents, right? And so the argument he makes is that, why don't you give us 30 cents? And then obviously you would say, well, why would we? Why? I don't, they don't understand how it works. Like, okay, we have all the stuff. You don't really have anything. The only thing you have is cheaper labor. And I know I'm going to sound like a capitalist when I say this, but otherwise there would be no reason to deal with these people at all. So you're going to get paid less because you have less, you have no leverage. And then if you're smart, you can build up that leverage through prolonged trade to fortify your position. And there's some great stories in this book about the initial encounters some European adventurers and travelers had with these tribes who were like living in fucking caves. And they would go up to the caves and they would place their wares just in front of them, and then they would go and then come back. They would see them scurry out like crabs and grab them. So even these fucking troglodytes knew how to trade, but there was something stopping them from utilizing that leverage to ever centralize their position or gain any sort of trade sovereignty. And so he's asking, well, why didn't they do that? Well, you didn't tell us how to do it. That's what he's saying. But like, it doesn't fucking matter. You were making 0, then you started making 5, and you're wondering why you weren't making 30. Why aren't I making as much as a Scotsman? I don't know. Like, why are you even asking that question? It should just be charity. Like, it's just charity at that point. It's like you should have given us more. Fuck you. How about we made a mistake giving you 5? Like, we should have just fucking taken it. It would have had the exact same effect.
Well, the argument that Rodney does make is that in a lot of ways, it is just taking it. There is no difference at all, and it's very explicit in the claim that like this really is just because of the difference in wages or the different levels of development. This is no different than just theft, and this is the principal argument of exploitation that we would see even in classical Marxist literature, even within European Marxism, that this is just like exploitation. It's not livable, and you can be rich by so many degrees that, you know, I don't like Tucker Carlson. Capitalism can work as a great model and a great system, but at the same time, like there is a truly eroding point where you can be exploited, you can be taken advantage of, family formation can't happen. But even here in Africa, like that's not really the case, because family formation does happen, and there are, you know, the birth rate has grown to a significant degree since imperialism had started. And it's something I don't think that really gets addressed here is that like, well, things could have been far worse and the material conditions did improve. Now, because there is an excess of maybe individuals, and it's all the arguments that we would talk about with like, well, there's not enough people, there's not enough structures to correct this issue, and now it's like, well, now we're dealing with the consequences of that. Those economic systems are not in place for you to meet the demand for your people, and so instead just like countless people are going to suffer. And like for me, this book reminds me a lot, at least tonally speaking, in what Cudahy calls the ordeal of civility. Is that a population or a group of people have been exposed to a system that is so radically alien and different to their own world that you can't help but generate a sense of resentment, or trying to impart your own understanding of the world and make it your thing in a system that really doesn't identify with you to begin with. And I mean, Cudahy makes this sort of as an explanation towards a lot of like Jewish practice or Marxism and Straussianism. But I think a lot of it can also be applied here, that you have now a large degree and population of individuals that are not really familiar with this world and don't really know how it works. And now that they've been exposed to it and are trying to cope with the system, especially after colonialism, which of course has its own sordid history, decolonialism does, because then you have to consider the Soviet and American involvement in there, French colonialism, the Suez Canal crisis, the history of Islam and Christianity in parts of Africa that still plays a major role in the region to this day. It's like, so what are we doing here? Instead, like the arguments that are being put in place here really only sound like anger and nothing more than desire for, you know, you have done a great harm and I want to bring you to justice.
No, absolutely. And I need to get to some of this more reading. We've just been complaining about Africa off the dome for a little bit now, but I think in a very even-handed way. I want to get to this part right here. I'm at page, here we go. Yeah, I'm on the page right now. He says, even when the, quote, experts from capitalist countries do not give a racist explanation, they nevertheless confuse the issue by giving as causes of underdevelopment the things which really are consequences. For example, they would argue that Africa is in a state of backwardness as a result of lacking skilled personnel to develop. It is true that because of lack of engineers, Africa cannot on its own build more roads, bridges, and hydroelectric stations. But that is not the cause of underdevelopment, except in the sense that it causes the effects to come together to reinforce each other. The fact of the matter is that the most profound reasons for the economic backwardness of a given African nation are not to be found inside that nation. All that we can find inside are the symptoms of underdevelopment and the secondary factors that make for poverty. Which doesn't even make sense if you think about it. Saying like, you guys are backwards. Okay. Why are you backwards? Well, because you're let's say you're facing backwards. You're oriented in a backwards way. Well, no. It's actually not because of our backwards orientation that we're backwards. It's because of you facing the opposite direction that makes us seem backwards. You see what I'm saying? Because what they're trying to do is like contextualize Africa against the West. So it's like, well, yeah, obviously you're backwards in comparison. It's like, well, I mean, it's just how you look at it. Maybe we're not backwards. Maybe it's just that you're looking at us the wrong way. It's like he does this all throughout the fucking book. It's like, the problem is how we define development at all. Like literally at one point in this book, he's saying that we just need to reconfigure what development even means, because if the term development includes not having the fucking wheel and sitting on a raft covered in flies, well then yeah, we are developed. We're developed if it includes pushing a raft with a big long fucking stick. So it's he plays these little word games, but then what's the point then? Okay, then you're developed. Congratulations. Fucking go home. This is the part I was talking about before. I absolutely love this part. Okay, is it 64 here? Yeah. And just scroll down. Here we go. So he says, when it comes to the question of manufacturing in Africa before the time of the white man, it is also essential to recognize where achievements have been underestimated. African manufacturers have been contemptuously treated or overlooked by European writers because the modern conception of the word brings to mind factories and machines. However, manufacturing means literally things made by hand, and African manufacturers, in this sense, have advanced appreciably. Most African societies fulfilled their own needs for a wide range of articles of domestic use, as well as for farming tools and weapons. As well as the Portuguese reached the Old Kingdom of Congo, or as soon as the Portuguese reached the Congo, they sent back word of the superb local cloths made from bark and palm fiber. Well, if the Portuguese said it, if the Portuguese
I would like to. Does he cite anything there? Like, does he have any citation for that?
I didn't see any. No.
Okay, I'm very curious. What the initial reports might have looked like.
I stopped looking for citations because I did that a few times throughout and couldn't find any, and I certainly didn't find any primary sources.
That was my This was my frustration with the text, is that there are quite a few, and this is what kind of irks me about a lot of bad political writing. For instance, you do not have to like Thomas Piketty, the French, I would call him a neo-Marxist in his economic understanding of things. But what Piketty does is at least provide a lot of first hand and primary and secondary sources for what he believes in or what he's writing about, which I greatly appreciate. There are some African writers that will do this. Rodney is not really one of them, which is really frustrating because I want firsthand sources. Maybe that's just a terrible Western, way of thinking, that I want primary sources and I'm not here for an autoethnography, but it's frustrating. That's all I'm going to say. It's frustrating.
Okay, here's another good part. I love this. Let me see. I think it's on this page. But anyway, I'll just read it here. It says, even the widespread resort to shifting cultivation with burning and light hoeing was not as childish as the first European colonists supposed. So he's of course referring to the fact that Africans, and you saw this in Australia too. There's a rumor, I don't know if this has been verified, it's just something I heard that makes sense, that Australia used to be a much more lush jungle, but that it was burned by the Aborigines because they, to this day, practice a form of hunting which involves just lighting anything green on fire and killing the animals that run screaming from the inferno. And so that could be perhaps why Australia just became a desert. But there was something similar like that going on in Africa. But that form of cultivation was not as childish as we might think. He continues on, the simple form of that simple form of agriculture was based on a correct evaluation of soil potential, which was not as great as initially appears from the heavy vegetation. And when the colonialists started upsetting the thin topsoil, the result was disastrous. However, it is not being suggested that African agriculture in the early period was superior to that of other continents. On the contrary, African standards of husbandry on the land and with livestock were not as high as those independently evolved in most parts of Asia and Europe. See, even there, he admits it. It's like, it is true. We didn't know what we were doing. And to his credit, look, I'm being fair here. A lot of people think that these jungles, the jungle primeval, you're thinking Central Africa, you're thinking South America, you think, well, it's such a temperate zone, it's so lush, you should be able to grow whatever you want there, but that's not the case. It's very, very difficult to grow in these sort of mountainous, hilly, rocky regions. To make farmland, you need to put a lot of work in. To make farmland, you would need to clear cut the jungle, which isn't to say that you couldn't in Africa, because they'll say, well, that's why they didn't do it. I'm like, well, they figured it out all over the world. You can convert the land, they just didn't. However, it's actually not as easy as all that. So continuing on here, it says, this is the part I wanted to quote the most. The weakness in Africa seemed to have been the lack of a professional interest in acquiring more scientific knowledge and in devising tools to lighten the load of labor, as well as transform hostile environments into areas suitable for human activity. That's so great. It's like, okay, the only thing that separates us is the interest in science and farming and developing techniques to labor easier. That's it. I mean, I agree. That's all. The only, really what he's saying, the only thing that separates Europe from Africa is the people and their minds. Are we in agreement? Do we show of hands who agrees with that? and then, of course, how do you resolve that? How do you solve that? Well, education, but you can't do that because that's capitalism. Because why isn't school capitalism, by the way? Like, if you think about students in a room facing forward learning math, that arguably is a hyper-capitalist way of learning, right? So you can't have schools, period, that exist outside the capitalist framework, right? Or is that too far?
Education becomes one of those weird topics where, depending on where Rodney is discussing it, it's either a tool of imperialism or it is a necessary communal function. And so for Europeans, for instance, like Christian parochial schools or those sort of programs that are instituted to teach agriculture, irrigation, etc., they become ways that are both like, well, this is capitalistic, but also it had provided much necessary information to human capital that we didn't have, or things like that. And so it just becomes a weird, it's when the Europeans do it, is it a tool of imperialism? But when we do it, it comes to show that we're not as backwards as perhaps these racist whites think we are.
I just love this school is jail bottom text. Really, though.
We haven't, at the end of the day, I just think to myself, wow, we've really not, so much of this discourse has not changed since, really ever. None of, like school is prison .green .bottom JPEG or whatever. It's just like the same thing when it comes to a lot of like post-colonial and colonial study like Rodney type characters. It's just like, well, like we've generated systemic underdevelopment and exploitation, and this is why, because we're so different, and there's all this hidden trauma or etc. Like this is the school to prison pipeline stuff. This is the why is our infant mortality rate so high in comparison to, say, you guys? And this is something that even Rodney complains about, is the differences in infant mortality rates in Africa, which of course Africa is just a large continent when he does these comparisons, like or Africa as the average type of what's the word I'm looking for? It's just the large type of take-home income. That's a table on there. It'll be like the United States, Canada, and then like Africa, Well, of course, with an asterisk next to it, and it's just like, well, that's like apples to oranges types of like statistical and economic comparison.
An
it's the
entire
same thing with like healthcare spending between the United States and like various European countries. I really don't think it's good statistical modeling to compare America to the U.S. when it comes to certain like healthcare spending. I think is a very good example. It's just like, okay, you have a federal system of a nation with like 330 plus million inhabitants in comparison to a state healthcare run system. I don't know, like let's take the UK for example. It's like with a vastly smaller population and different federal spending structures or non-federal spending at all. It doesn't have a federalist model. I mean, so like to make comparison to like, oh, average home pay of a Canadian versus like the average African, and it's like, well, that's so vast. Like this is not. But of course, that argument.
Yeah. Well, no, that's a great point. Where earlier on we we're saying, oh, his argument was. The average Irishman makes 30 cents a day, and the average African makes 5 cents a day. It was like the spending power of that 5 cents in Africa is tremendous, right? Like he's just again, that's too much.
But also,
of a
like, where in Africa? Like, are we talking about like? Is 5 cents in Johannesburg comparable to 5 cents in Dublin?
Well,
but also it's like it's 5 cents in the middle of nowhere. Benin, former German African colony, is that even comparable to, 5 cents in say, I don't know, Omaha, Nebraska? Like it's just it's ridiculous.
And you raised a really good point that I forgot to mention earlier. But in reading this book, I don't know if you noticed the same thing, that he gets once again very slippery about the language concerning comparing the entire continent of Africa to a specific country. So it's Africa versus the United States, but then sometimes it's Ethiopia versus Europe, But I think it serves whatever the argument is if he treats Africa, because he is a Pan-Africanist, as one united country, which is a very low resolution way of looking at the problem. to say that the entire continent is owed equally. And this is what you see even with memes now, and everyone's been referring to the meme in the chat where it's a little one panel cartoon of Africa, just a hole in the earth, and then it's all piled up in America.
Or Europe, yeah.
Which has informed one of my favorite arguments I've seen recently, which is that, and the number goes up every time I hear it, that Europe owes Africa $30 trillion. And then it's 45, then it's 100. It's just whatever. And then it'll be up from trillion after that. Right? It's just, you owe us infinity money.
Yeah, it's the same argument that I hear quite often when it comes to, here in America, reparations to blacks. The calculation and the model will change depending on who you ask. And it's ridiculous, I think, in a lot of ways that we have that we entertain these politically, but also it's just like, well, any solution that we're going to have is not going to be amenable, I think, to really anybody, which I think is the worst part. And so now it just becomes this like perpetual political cudgel that will be used for the purposes of just like, well, we can, threaten this so-called, sword of Damocles over your head. And it's just like, well, really all that this is for like the purposes of, keeping the coalition so our guys get what we want.
Yeah. And I'll tell you this, something you just said triggered this thought about a relationship with Africa. Is I've said this to them quite a few times, but really, why did we avert course? Because he mentions in this book how it was Britain, the UK, that was pushing abolition of slavery before any other nation. And I love this part. I don't know if we'll get to it this episode, or this reading rather, but he blames Europe for creating and causing slavery. He's clear about that. But then he also blames them for abolishing slavery. And it's unfair that so many slave empires suddenly lost their means of revenue. So it's like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And but I would say to them that here's one explanation they probably don't hear very often, is that the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. Look, if it was such low-hanging fruit, if it was just one giant pussy waiting to be fucked, they probably wouldn't have stopped. But here's what actually happened. It's that it turns out that they were investing more than they were getting out of it. That seems to be what happened in many cases, that in trying to corral and educate and build up these nations, because they had to, you go into these nations and these countries, these tribes, these fucking regions, and you need to build infrastructure. Otherwise, you can't fucking do anything, of course. And it turns out you're just investing so much, it's actually not worth it to get out whatever that resource is, unless you've got a Cecil Rhodes, unless you've got an enigmatic genius doing it, or and there's examples of it, but it's not just a one-way street. It's not that we came in with a big shovel and dug up all the gold and flung it back home. It's like, no, there was insane investment going on. And you're seeing that even with China right now. And I don't know if these types, the Walter Rodneys of the world, can make sense of what China's doing in Africa, going in and also building infrastructure for the purposes of resource extraction, but you weren't using the fucking resources anyway. So what are you even complaining about? But it's at the end of the day, it's the same thing with India. Like, how much did Britain invest in transforming India, or trying to at least, and elevating these people and doing what they were trying to do in Africa too? And now that's used against them.
Well, I think that becomes the interesting question: is how much of are the Chinese is liable for, say, anti-colonialism, or like are they the subject of into anti-colonialist literature as, say, the white man is? And I would argue no, just because China is uniquely different than the United States, or it doesn't share the same history. But it's like, well, they're doing more or less the same thing, which is resource extraction. And it is for the explicit purpose of developing and enriching their own needs, which is also repairing roads that have not been maintained since the Europeans left.
Yeah. It's like there's been documentaries about this. It's unignorable. It's like they should have never let camera crews in Africa. This is as bad or worse than allowing cops to have body cams. You thought you were going to find all kinds of secret racism. It turns out that there's just black guys with knives running, screaming at lady cops. Oopsie. Oopsie daisy. Reality comes crashing down upon you. And then we're just so inundated by it. We've got information poisoning. We go, yeah. Lady cops are being stabbed by black guys. Of course. What'd you expect? And now that's something that we deal with. Yeah, we've actually spent $3 trillion in Africa trying to turn it into something manageable, and it hasn't, but that's just what you do. No ticky, no laundry. Prudentialist has the talking gun in his mouth right now.
No, I don't. I don't. But I'm letting you gem out for right now. I do think one of the particularly interesting things is the discussion, one of the central thesis of this text, besides like European colonialism holds back Africa, is the central claim that one of the biggest, if not the largest, causes of European or African underdevelopment is the European slave trade, and that because of it, functionally speaking, Africa loses vital human capital. And because of it, we now have to deal with a greatly depopulated Europe, and also that we had race and tribal backgrounds being used now as an item or as a tool to prevent further economic unity or political alliances, and instead had created political factionalism that would reduce the overall strength of any potential further European development.
Do you want to hear two great things back to back?
Are we reading from the book?
Yeah. I'm going to just read this. I love this. So these are 100 pages apart. So I'm going to start with the later one and go to the earlier one. So it says here, it would be extremely simple-minded to say that colonialism in Africa or anywhere else caused Europe to develop its science and technology. The tendency towards technological innovation and renovation was inherent in capitalism itself because of the drive for profits. I think that's an interesting, and let's not say admission, but it's almost a surrender that there is no technology, period, without capitalism. And again, I guess that would depend on how you define technology. Or is the steam engine technology, is a fork technology, right? Because he wants to define manufacturing as anything that's made by hand. Well, I mean, you could say technology is a horse and buggy, which they also didn't have, but was that developed by capitalism? Is a fireplace capitalism too? Of course, he would never ask these questions. Continue on. He says, however, it would be entirely accurate to say that the colonization of Africa and other parts of the world formed an indispensable link in a chain of events which made possible the technological transformation of the base of European capitalism. Without that link, European capitalism would not have been producing goods and services at the level attained in 1960. In other words, our very yardsticks for measuring development and underdevelopment nations would have been different. Which, that last sentence stuck with me. Which is like, if it wasn't for capitalism, our entire definition of development would be different. Like, well, if you concede that there would be no technological development without it, well, I guess you're true, because then we would be judging development by what? The paint on our faces as we dance around the fucking fire? What are you talking about, Rodney? I'm glad you blew up, asshole. But then he can see he's introducing the idea that, well, if you think about it, it was because of us that you developed technologically at all. Okay, so then we start with that, and then we go back to page 108, and he says, Africa being drawn into the orbit of Western Europe speeded up the latter's technological development. So it's like that, where he says, I'm not saying that we're directly responsible for it, but then he's 100 pages earlier, he's saying, but we were. He continues on, for example, okay, let's just, deep breath, here we go. For example, the evolution of European shipbuilding from the 16th century to the 19th century was the logical consequence of their monopoly of sea commerce in that period. During that time, the North Africans were bottled up in the Mediterranean, and although it was from them that the Europeans initially borrowed a great deal of nautical instrumentation, no sources cited for that, by the way, in case you're wondering. No asterisks there. The North Africans made no further worthwhile advances. Again, that's the cool thing. Like, they stole all the stuff from the North Africans. Did the North Africans do anything with it? No.
But it's also like, okay, the North Africans. Are we talking about the Egyptians? Are we talking about the Egyptian kingdoms? Are we talking about the Byzantine Empire? Are we talking about the ancient Tunisians? Are we talking about the Phoenicians? Like, who are we talking about here?
We cannot let these people claim North Africa.
No, that's my point. This is just like,
exactly, like, and I'm going to make a bold claim. I think Europe's got to start claiming that. And I know you don't want to, but we've already made concessions, including the Mediterranean. Right. So, like, honestly, Greeks can go either way, but we made an executive decision to say, no, we're taking the Greeks. We're not letting the Arabs have the Greeks. All right. But I think it strategically, we need to deny Africa, Egypt. That's ours now. Yay or nay? We're claiming Egypt, and you know what?
You're gonna have to consider. What's the word I'm looking for? You're going to have to greatly consider, say, this is the other thing too, is like Islam gets mentioned in this text, and it's also one of the caveats I would make for this conversation. It's just like, you have to consider what those places were like before the Arabs and the Turks. And if you're not going to put those into consideration, then like we're in a weird place to examine these things politically speaking.
Here's the last part of the thing I was saying. He says, where the original European advantage was not sufficient to assure supremacy, they deliberately undermined other people's efforts. By the way, didn't prove that at all. Because this is that ego thing where he's saying, Europeans weren't so fucking great. They learned building ships from the North Africans. So the North Africans were superior. Why did the North Africans do it? They didn't want to. What do you mean they didn't want to? Continuing on, it says, the Indian Navy, for instance, suffered from the rigid reinforcement of the English navigation laws. Yet the expenses involved in building new and better European ships were met from the profits of overseas trade with India and Africa. So why? How could they even? How could they even build ships if it wasn't for trade? You see what I'm saying? It was we was all the way down, isn't it? People have been saying that in the chat already. We was ships. It's like you can't just say we was Europe. You can't just say we was trade. You can't say you can't be the product of trade and also say you constituted the entire trade itself. You see what I'm saying? Like you can't just be like an ontological concept. You can't be a political concept, motherfucker. I'm sorry you were slaves. All right, I'll be the first to say it. I think we shouldn't have done slavery. I think that was a waste of time. I think we've paid for it in spades. You just I'm getting nothing.
You're having a
for
lot
Prude.
of fun. You're having a lot of fun tonight.
I gotta bring it because I'm keeping Prude from saying it.
You're really not.
I'm the only thing keeping the wolf from the door from you people.
So I'm gonna, for instance, let's take a look here. I'm gonna scroll. So, for instance, I mentioned religion. It's a particularly interesting one. So, it should also. So, for instance, he talks about regards to say Islam and Christianity. African dance and art were almost. This is page 57 of the PDF. African dance and art were almost invariably linked with a religious world outlook in one way or another. As is well known, traditional African religious practices exist in a great variety, and should also be remembered that both Islam and Christianity found homes in the African continent almost from their very inception. The features of traditional African religions help set African cultures apart from one another in these countries, but in this present context, it's more important to note how much African religion had in common with religion elsewhere and how this can be used as an index of development in Africa before European impact in the 15th century. I'm gonna press X to doubt on that one because I don't think you could even. I don't think you can compare. I don't think it is comparable at all of pre-Christian religious traditions in Europe, Greek, Roman, or otherwise Germanic, to various African traditions. I don't think they're comparable. I don't hold to that sort of universalist position. They're not comparable at all. But carrying on when talking about religion, especially and this is where I find really interesting is that. You notice this on various Twitter posts where it's like an immigrant poster talking about, well, in my culture, like the communal family meal is very important. We call this dinner or something like that, right? Like I'm being somewhat strawman-y here.
No. You're not strawman that much. Where it says in my culture, family is very important.
Which I'm like, okay, so is it in mine?
It's important in every culture. No, but you have to understand, like dinner,
it's very important in mine. But so, for instance,
we have a special space for it.
Yeah. Okay. But so, for instance, this when we're talking about religion, for instance, he says, in Africa before the 15th century, the predominant principle of social relations was that of the family and kinship associated with communalism. Every member of an African society had his position defined in terms of relatives on his mother's side and his father's side. Wait a second, I have that too. Some societies place greater importance on matrilineal ties and others on patrilineal ties. We see this as well. Not so much in Europe. I think you have more of the Hational line than anything else. Those things were crucial to the daily existence of a member of an African society because land, the major means of production, was owned by groups such as family or clan. Where have I seen that before? Scotland, etc. Like families.
Yeah, you've got it right there.
It's not uniqueness to me. Like it's just these things also existed in Europe. But it's also the denial that the Europeans ever had them.
It's also like. This is why anarcho-communism is the only subset that makes sense to me, because right there, they try and make the argument that it's due to capitalism that we have the concept of like owning people or owning things, but there he establishes, no, you had the concept of ownership. It was group ownership of the land. You had tribes. What is a tribe if not a hierarchy of dominance and also ownership over land and farms and homesteads and people? Like, are you honestly telling me that within these feudal orientations that the father wasn't the patriarch of the household and that implied a certain ownership over the family? Like, shut the fuck up. Because that's what they try and say, that capitalism is such a broad term because it encompasses all forms of power and ownership. And then a lot of leftist thinkers are really trying to grapple with the implications and the depth of that, and they get almost metaphysical about it. But just right there, you show that no, okay, before European contact, you had a conceptualization of ownership and power, and you had slaves, you had it all. The only thing you lacked was competence. The only thing you lacked, as you indicated earlier, was a drive to do anything ever. That was it. And you had all the resources you could ever need. You could have been dominant if you wanted to. You just didn't want to. And a much more interesting book would be, why didn't we want to? It's not why we're, because even pre-currency, because Marx gets into this. If you read Capital by Marx, I actually quite like the beginning of that book because he's breaking down like the concept of the surplus and stuff, and how, I won't get into too much of it right now, but he describes a barter society. Okay, what is a barter society? Well, obviously, okay, I've got 2 loaves of bread and I need 4 horseshoes. So I'm going to go over and try and trade my bread for horseshoes. But he doesn't want 2 loaves of bread. He thinks he deserves 3 loaves of bread. Now, in that transaction, the guy with the bread is an African. The guy with the horseshoe is white. And he's saying, why won't you give me the horseshoes for free? Why won't you take 1 loaf of bread even? That's unfair. I think that's unfair. I think we have a disagreement on what this is worth. So that is theft. That you're taking something from me. You're denying me having the horseshoes which I deserve. Why do I deserve them? Because I want them. That's it. And that's what you're dealing with every single fucking time. You're dealing with that in America. You're dealing with that with every black intellectual. You're dealing with that with every fucking black lady university student. That is the core of every single argument. It's just, don't even pretend that equity means anything to them. It's just, I think I should have this, and you're standing in the way of that by not giving it to me. The end. And there's no negotiating with these people.
The other thing too, as well, is that I mentioned the ordeal of civility earlier, and one of the most important takeaways I think out of this entire book is when Walter Rodney is describing the various regions of Africa. So he does spend some time discussing in these short, kind of minute paragraph histories of the African continent. And this includes things like Western Sudan, Ethiopia especially, because it's still one of the more principally majority Christian areas that hasn't faced significant amount. I mean, it still has a Muslim population, but not to the degree in which places like Nigeria or other areas that you could call, with a Christian population have experienced. But I say all this in part because towards the conclusion, as he discusses each region and their environment or their relationship to the Europeans who came there, in the conclusion, he makes a very explicit claim that I think is very important to consider, which is the introduction of the concept of development in the capitalist sense of the term. And it's this that I think is the most important thing out of the book to discuss, is that because we have introduced this term to these African countries, we have now suddenly allowed and generated a measuring stick by which Africans can now be claimed to be backwards or underdeveloped, and because of that, we can now use this against the Africans and hold them back.
Do you want to hear an African story? I know we gotta get going soon, but if anyone's got any lingering questions in the chat, send them now. I have a whole section on accounts of Africa, and I would be remiss if I didn't get to a couple. This is one that I was talking about earlier about the living in the caves. I was somewhat incorrect, so I'm just going to read it here. It says, to the south of Ghana lay the important sources of gold on the upper Senegal and its tributary, the Falemé. It is said that Ghana obtained its gold by silent or dumb barter, which is described as follows. The merchants beat great drums to summon the local natives who were naked and lived in holes in the ground. From these holes, which were doubtless the pits from which they dug the gold, they refused to emerge in the presence of foreign merchants. The latter, therefore, used to arrange their trade goods in piles on the riverbank and retire out of sight. The local natives then came and placed a heap of gold beside each pile they withdrew. If the merchants were satisfied, they took the gold and retreated, beating their drums to signify that the market was over. He continues here, the writer of the above lines, E.W. Boville, a supposed European authority on Western Sudan, then goes on to say that silent trade or dumb barter was a feature of the Western Sudan's gold trade throughout all the centuries until modern times. Actually, he says, the only dumb... okay, get this. Actually, the only thing dumb about trade is what he writes about it.
Is that what he says?
Yes.
Oh, my. We have to understand... Okay, surely the rest of you in the chat know this, but what the word dumb used to mean. Okay, I'm just getting that out there. Dumb and slow of speech, meaning mute or silent.
Yeah, so he writes that. Here's the next sentence. He says, the story of dumb barter for gold in West Africa is repeated in several accounts, starting with ancient Greek scripts. So it's like...
So it's been there for a while.
It's been there... He's saying this is how they did it for centuries. Why did he say that? Because we have centuries of documents saying this is how it was done. And then Walter, this is why you can't trust any of the source. If there's any sources, don't trust them, because he just said he reads the primary source of the account and says that's dumb. That's it. That's the amount of research he puts into this. And this is why I love the section on accounts of Africa. Let me see if I can get one more here. Let's see. Okay. I'll try this one. Let's get back to 130. Scroll down here. That's somewhere on here. Anyway, I'll just leave it here. A Portuguese embassy reached the Ethiopian court in 1520. Having examined the Portuguese swords, muskets, clothes, books, and other objects, the Emperor Lebna Dengel felt the need to introduce European technical knowledge into Ethiopia. Correspondence exists between the emperor and European rulers such as Kings Manuel I and John III of Portugal and Pope Leo X, in which requests were made for European assistance to Ethiopian industry. Until the late 19th century, Ethiopian petitions to that effect were being repeated with little or no success. In the first half of the 18th century, there were two further examples of African rulers appreciating European technology and stating their preference for skills and not slave ships. When Agaja Trudeau of Dahomey sought to stop the trading captives, he made an appeal to European craftsmen, and he sent an ambassador to London for that purpose. One European who stayed in the court of Dahomey told his countrymen that if any tailor, carpenter, smith, or any sort of white man that is free be willing to come here, he will find very good encouragement. And apparently nothing happened. So what he was saying there was there were African kingdoms that in Ethiopia specifically that were begging to be taught how to make technology, and Europe didn't want to.
So he's asking for foreign direct investment.
Yeah, right? Like just foreign direct investment, or if not that, then just come here and teach us things for free. Like what would the upside be? Again, I'm sure that's a corrupted capitalist way of looking at it, but you can't just say give me free stuff constantly, and then you're surprised when people are just politely saying no. And or it would be direct foreign investment, or there's something else, or it would be the schools that you claim are polluting their minds. You see what I'm saying? So it's like he's using that as like, how dare they deny us? Well, why? Then why not just give us slaves? It's not fair that you have so many black people. That's the argument. It's like, it turns out that Africa has like 100% of the black people on earth. It's fucked up that they don't share. Right? So we had to take it because they weren't sharing. That's called justice.
Amazing.
All right. Prude is taking every one of those comments and weighting it in his mind, figuring out if this is going to be the end of everything.
It won't. No. I think the other thing to really consider out of this entire section in particular, for those that have read the text or have perhaps read something similar, is that you're going to see especially with those that have the capacity, like Ethiopia especially. Ethiopia is often prided in a lot of world history classes, like as the one African country that had never really been conquered until Mussolini. I don't really agree with that sentiment entirely, but like, yes, there were African or there were Ethiopian leadership and things, etc., that definitely plays a role in their own development. But like in that whole instance, that's what I would call capitalism. Like, this is a request for foreign direct investment. We want, dare I say, elite human capital to come into the country, and they would be welcomed. And in fact, we would welcome it, because it means that, you know, this kind of manufactures and trade would jumpstart the Kingdom of Ethiopia's development, and it would be good for Ethiopia in comparison to regional powers. And it's just like, this, of course, is in, what, the 1500s? And it's just like, that would be a massive win for the Ethiopian kingdom in comparison to, say, you know, other powers or regions in the area. But like, we can't frame that as capitalist. We have to blame this as like, those Europeans obviously didn't come. And it's like, well, why didn't they come? Well, we can't argue, like you had mentioned, you know, the lemon ain't worth the squeeze. And it's like, well, why? And it's like, well, that's a massive amount of investment. We're not even taking into other historical factors in the area, like which the Portuguese and the Spaniards and their introduction into the arrival into the Americas, and wars in Europe that would have played a significant role at the time. And it's just like, so instead, like, we have a very thin understanding of history that doesn't ever consider why the Europeans did what they did, or perhaps, like, you know, this isn't purely exploitative, but it's the only model that works. And that we're introducing these European capitalist concepts, and because of that, this is why we're so underdeveloped. Not to mention all of the wars, all of the diseases, all of the lack of population from slavery. It's just, these things fundamentally just, it's only one frame of reference. And that frame of reference is only going to work because we say so, or because Marxism tells me that this is how it works. No other potential explanation.
Yeah, you all heard about the magic dirt hypothesis, but this is something like the magic ideas hypothesis, that things that just occurred to Europeans earlier and that put them on a pathway to success that was denied to Africans. I saw this interview recently because in Canada we've had a massive influx of Indians, Indian, both legal and illegal mass migration. And I saw this interview from Brampton, Ontario, which is now well over 80% Indian. It used to be, of course, 100% white town not even that long ago. And there's an interview with a young Indian woman saying that, oh, I liked living here. I liked living among my own people. It feels just like India, except it's clean and we have free healthcare. And I bring that up because even now, even amongst the vast diaspora of these peoples, there's still a complete and total inability to grasp what it is we're talking about, which is, it's not just magic. It's not just we lucked into living here, right? It's not just that, oh, we built, you know, because we did trade differently, we have bigger ships, and that's what. It's not the content of our character. It's never the content of our character. It's always the content of their character that they should be judged by. White Europeans, white people, we never get judged on the content of our character. Not really, for all the stuff that we do. It's always some trick, some luck, some dodge, some hustle that did it. But I think more and more people are being confronted with that because there is no intellectual veracity to anything these people say. It's all just bitterness and funny mythology and just believing that if 100% of their country moved to America and moved to Canada, that they won't make it into the place they're trying to escape from. You cannot explain that to them. Like, there's no dialogue.
That's the phenomenon of like the Jared Diamond, you know, geographical determinism, because this is always trying to scapegoat the And again, they would call, and even when you try to discuss HBD, as you saw from the late Dr. James Watson, who had passed away and was vilified and canceled later a few years ago for discussing, of course, the edgiest of all edgy, third rail of academia, which is, of course, like the heritability of IQ and intelligence, all that sort of stuff. And of course, he had said comments that would not be too far off from what your average HBD poster, even like Steve Saylor, would talk about. And I think Steve Saylor is particularly tame. And so it just comes to show that because you can't even discuss that without it being called 19th century imperialist race science, that you can't come to a full explanation. And it's not the complete explanation. I don't want to say that I'm not a complete hereditary determinist. I think that there are other factors in play here. Like, you're not going to get a major empire with a good road system because there's a giant fucking Sahara desert, But at the same time, what empires did exist really do seem to emerge more so after the rise and expansion of Islam into the territory. Or into the continent and makes its distance. These things don't get discussed when we talk about colonialism, because it's like, well, how much of what existing development may have been there comes from, Islam and Roman/Byzantine influences on the area. According to some Christian traditions, like the first place that St. Matthew goes to is like Ethiopia, and it's just like, so how much did that work out for the Ethiopians? Did how much of that led to their own development, et cetera, et cetera. These are things that don't typically get discussed because it would require us to look at pre-colonial history. And when pre-colonial history does get mentioned, it's almost never in a way that's good. For instance, some of the earliest, I think one of the earliest peace treaties that exists with ancient Egypt, for example, I think is between one of the Nubian kingdoms and one of the, I want to say it's one of the early or middle, ancient Egyptian kingdoms. And it's well, cool. Now we have this history record, but that's one time. And this is several thousands of years BC. We don't have sort of an equivalent. And I think that that's sort of interesting to consider in the history of the world. It's so we have to go that far back to find something. And that should be pretty telling.
I absolutely agree. And also, I know we got to get going soon. But I want to get to this one thing because I think it kind of brings some things into focus that we're just talking about. Page 234 here, he says, what did colonial governments do in the interest of Africans? Supposedly, they built roads, schools, hospitals, and the like. I like supposedly. Well, they did. You can't just say they didn't, asshole.
They did, and then they all left, and then they weren't maintained. There's that famous interview. It's is there a Kenyan or Swahili word for maintain?
Yes, people have been bringing that up in the chat. They're referencing what's the direct translation to maintenance.
Yeah, it's a famous sort of gotcha. Well, I want to say that is a gotcha, but that's famously there.
But they got 20 different words for Air Jordans. So he says here, the sum total of these services was amazingly small. For the first 3 decades of colonialism, hardly anything was done that could remotely be termed a service to the African people. Well, because, again, just across these sentences, he says, yes, they built roads and schools and hospitals, but it was amazingly small. Almost like they didn't do anything at all. Well, no, I mean, we went from, at the very least, 0 schools to 1 school. It switched the binary there. Continuing on, he says, it was, in fact, only after the last war that social services were built as a matter of policy. How little they amounted to does not really need illustrating. After all, the statistics which show that Africa today is underdeveloped are the statistics representing the state of affairs at the end of colonialism. This is where we get into the hard numbers. Let me make sure I've scrolled down here. Yeah, okay, so people can read it too. He says, after all the statistics, okay, in 1934, long before the coming of the welfare state to Britain, expenditure for social services in the British Isles amounted to £6 15 per person. In Ghana, the figure was 7 shillings 4 pence per person, and that was high by colonial standards. In Nigeria, in Nysataland, it was less than 1 shilling 9 pence per head. And then you read that and say, okay, hold on, wait. So they were just getting money from the British government as a colony. It was just less. So a British citizen would be getting £6 15 shillings, but you were still getting 7 shillings 4 pence based on expenditures, based on just not only infrastructure but also schools, also hospitals, and also welfare. Just that was money that would not be there otherwise, that you were benefiting from. So how can you can't say it's zero when it's 7 shillings 4 pence? And again, this is just it's I don't want to call it ingratitude, but it's just lying with data and saying it didn't even fucking matter. You're just spending. You just made a welfare state. You just gave us free shit and built us things, but you might as well not have. Okay, can we take it back? Because it seems that all of your wars of independence are fought to seize control of all of these institutions. You know what I mean? Like it must be stressed before we end this, how many of these African nations got exactly what they wanted. The revolutions were successful. It was these revolutions that blew Walter Rodney the fuck to hell. They kicked out the colonists. The colonists retreated, and they let them keep all the stuff. They let them keep the roads, the bridges, the hospitals, the schools, the government buildings, the guns, the wealth, whatever the fuck. They got to keep it, and they didn't do anything with it. Still. It's actually just Haiti over and over and over again. And I think that's one of the reasons that I think the narrative surrounding blacks specifically has to change, because at this point, what do they want? What are they asking for? What's the only thing a black radical is asking for right now is just open violence against white people. I don't hear anything else. I don't hear any economic solutions. The only other economic solution I said is give $50 million to every black person. That's it. That's all you hear in America. Again, like I said, the trillions of reparations goes up every year.
There are two super chats that I have. One is from Wingman 45, and he says, how do we get these individuals or just regular people to fathom how much other groups have this hate and resentment towards them? I'm just thinking of like a Dilbert comic. Like, imagine how much the other guy hates me. And I'm like, well, I think that's becoming more abundantly true as immigration plays out. I think that you witnessed the transformation of the global perception of India. I'd keep that in consideration. And then the other one comes from a YouTube super chatter who sends $20 Canadian, which is very grateful, and I say thank you. He says, "You guys are getting paid?" Yeah, a little bit. This is not my day job. I'm not gonna quit my job tomorrow to do this.
I do like he said you guys are getting paid as he's paying us.
Yeah,
but
I
guess
it's probably in reference to the amount of social services that some groups get.
Oh, I think that super chat was from way earlier. Though.
Oh.
But
it tells you how much I'm paying attention.
Yeah, and I was puzzling over it this entire time. I guess closing thoughts on this book. We've read quite a few excerpts. I got to get the broad strokes out there.
You got your spicy takes out of the way.
They're not even that spicy. You know what I mean?
No, they're real. Well, no, they're not. It's no different than the shit I would see on Twitter. Like, it's really, and I mean, like, it's also interesting in comparison to like what other groups would say about themselves, which is all. I think the more interesting part is how Africans view other Africans.
Yeah, the most offensive thing in this book was, or this episode rather, was written by Walter Rodney, where he just outright said, like, "Well, excuse me for not inventing science like the rest of you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that Africans just didn't have a civilizational drive to invent ways of sparing manual labor. Like he said that. I didn't say it. Fucking, you didn't hear that on War Strike. You heard it from the mouth of an African Marxist in the 70s who's saying that it's our fault that they didn't, but still that they couldn't.
Who would get blown up under political circumstances of extremism?
Blown up by the socialist government that was the result of the socialist revolution that he was championing the entire time.
Who, I mean? This was days after he got back from celebrating Zimbabwe's independence.
Yeah.
After Rhodesia had fallen.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just, and I think more people than ever are hip to this. What do you think? Closing thoughts on this book?
Well, as I had mentioned, it's one of those books that, to some extent, I'm glad I read, but also at the same time, it's not something that I haven't heard before. And I don't mean that to be with hubris or like, oh, I didn't get anything out of this. I mean, it is stuff I have heard before from other anti-colonial literature or things like that. But also at the same time, it's the kind of stuff that anyone has probably heard before, because these kind of arguments have been in place for your entire life. We have to understand that like anti-colonialism has been a thing for centuries. Well, not really centuries, but it's only been from the 20th century onward. And as we talked about in the last book, The Hour of Decision, like this is a consequence of the revolutions we had in political thought in the West. Marxism, Leninism, Bolshevism, communism, redistributive, like market liberalism, all these things took place here first, and they get levied out and spread to other parts of the world. And one of the other parts of the world, of course, being in the African continent. And we now know what that looks like. And the consequences of that are going to be exactly what you read in this book today.
Yeah, and I think the reasoning behind covering this book today, I think one of the original reasons was to really flesh out what Oswald Spengler was saying about the Third World Revolution, the Color World Revolution. This is what the Colored World Revolution looks like. And like we said before, it is just a cloak for just identity-based ethnic resentments. And it's got a lot of interesting terminology. It's got some very flimsy anti-capitalist theory, but that's not really what it's about. I don't think there's not the same concern or interest in economics I can see here as in the German investigations or the other European investigations. They don't give a fuck about that. This is just a cudgel to wield against the West, against Europe, and that's what it is in every single one of these instances. So I think it's good to know what they're saying, because this is still referenced amongst these people. And it was, I don't know if I was even in the right headspace for this, because leading into the recording and the live stream today, I was finishing up a film. Did you see that one? What was it? Every Battle All at Once? What was it?
One Battle After Another. I have not seen it. I know the premise. I saw. I read. I think it was Bret Easton Ellis that had given the really incisive review, saying like this is just like liberal or woke abundance. It's like what? It's Leonardo DiCaprio, who's a former sort of fascist white nationalist revolutionary who turns on his own people because his mixed race daughter has been held captive.
No, well, it's the opposite. He was a member of the Weather Underground.
Oh,
so okay. Actually, the way I would describe it is, and I got this sense early on, but it's the Antifa version of American History X.
Oh, okay.
Which we haven't seen before, not really, which isn't to say that there isn't subversive script writing or leftist elements in film, but this is it's made by Paul Thomas Anderson, and it's well acted, it's well made. Yes. Sean Penn is an interesting character, but it wasn't lampooning or satirizing the subject matter in the same way American History X wasn't really satirizing the white nationalist or the skinhead movement. In fact, it was entering into that world. And for the first half of American History X, they're just doing badass things. Derek is dunking the fucking basketball game, right? Like it makes them look cool. And there's so much in this book that's just the Antifa version of that. That when they're like, here's things that Antifa
Would you call it an Antifa recruitment movie?
Kind of. Because I'll tell you, there's things that I know Antifa think are really, really cool that only they think are cool. For example, Hispanic teen skateboarding. That is portrayed as like a really cool, dangerous thing in this. And for the rest of us, that seems gay and lame. But in this movie, all like the Antifa stuff, it's sort of like pro-immigration. It's not anti-revolutionary. It centers the revolutionary dynamic. Leonardo DiCaprio plays a very interesting character. That's what makes it work. That he is the burned out revolutionary. He's a guy who was in the weather underground of the past. He escaped all that. He was raising the daughter of the leader, like the lady leader. They had a kid together. She left for Mexico. He's raising his mixed race daughter all by himself. But I think it's a valuable piece of media because I haven't seen one made about this type of guy, which is the burned out revolutionary. He spends his days in his fucking trailer just smoking weed, watching old movies, and saying those were the days. Like, he's still that guy. He's still possessing of all that ideology, but he's just very cynical. And I'm like, that's like a fun character. And he's still a dad. So he has these moments where he's like, his teenage daughter's about to go to the dance, and you see the type of daughter that guy raises, who's standing up to authority, standing up to his authority, calling him by his name Bob, but he's still like threatening her boyfriend, saying like, anything you do to her tonight, I'm going to do to you and your friends. So he's still got like dad stuff, like patriarchal stuff inside of him. Anyway, so he's like kind of reconciling those things. I'm like, okay, like this is an interesting guy to see in a film. However, the entire movie, I think, is just trying to popularize and you what they. Okay, sorry, I'm spending too long on this.
No, you're fine. Keep going.
Here's the scene that tipped me off that this was a pro-Antifa thing, and I saw a similar plot point in that movie Eddington, because even if you're trying to criticize Antifa, you can never admit that they instigate riots. So there's a scene in this where there's like a bunch of Mexicans protesting something. They got the face masks on. They got the placards. They're all dressed up, stand off with the police. Then Sean Penn's character, who's kind of like Josh Brolin's character in Inherent Vice, the sort of straight-laced. If there's any character that's like a satirization, it's that character. But he's trying to dispel the crowd, and so he goes on the radio and calls in, I forget what it's called, some kind of code word, and then you see a car drop off, a bad actor, like one of their guys dressed up as Antifa, who lights the Molotov cocktail and throws in. They use that as an excuse to use the water cannons and the tear gas on them. The idea here being that Antifa never throw Molotov cocktails. They never instigate riots. It's always the CIA or a far right group that's trying to make them look bad. And the moment I saw that, I said, "Fuck you!" Like that's, I don't know. Like there's. People will involve Antifa in movies now, but they always need to be passive. They're only ever peaceful protesters, and their revolution is seen as kitschy and optimistic or even naive, but it's not to be taken seriously. And that to me is that's the laundering of the idea to the public that don't worry about it. They're just like your fucking teenage daughter. It doesn't matter. It's like, no, these motherfuckers are preparing for war. And why are you writing movies where they're not? Like, that's what made me, like, I don't know if I would recommend the movie, but it's a interesting thing.
I saw I saw a clip of it where he rescues the daughter, and I was like, okay, I think I'm done here. I've got the gist, and I was more or less fine with it. I wasn't going to watch it anyway. In the same way, I had no desire to watch the Garland's Civil War movie. I mean, I got the premise of it, and which was the journalists are so fucking cool, but that was it. I don't have much. It's just, I mean, this is the thing. This is the last thing I'll say, and then we really do have to call it. Is I like the YouTuber Feral Historian. I don't agree with him on everything politically. He seems sort of like a kind of like center libertarian, kind of older white guy, older millennial. But he's a college professor somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. I don't know. But I like his videos because all he does is just talk about pop culture, history, and stuff like that. It's very entertaining. It's very, it's good content. And if I were to ever rebrand or if I were to ever restart, that might be the kind of stuff I do. But anyways, he talked about, in one of his more recent videos, he talked about the issue of race. And he had said that, like, you don't have to like race or whatever, but like race is a narrative in which binds people, even if it's not always accurate. But I also kind of find it a little naive because it's just like, well, that's true, but also like race is inherently real to ethnic identity, and that will be used against you whether you like it or not. And that's something that I think leaves a lot of Western academics, especially like white liberal academics, totally unprepared for dealing with the reality of the very things that they discuss, whether it's like anti-colonialism or whatever. It's like, no, those things are real, and it'll be used against you like a cudgel. And I think that that's something that was particularly interesting about this book is that like you can come up with a Marxist interpretation for it, but the only thing that I'm looking at when I look at this book is just this is an ideological cover for justifying a takeover or to eliminate my political rivals on racial grounds.
That's probably a good place to end. I know you gotta get going. I wasn't gonna keep you this long.
No, it's okay.
There's someone here who made a point. Says it's well made. At times I feel like you say it's well made about every movie you review. First of all, I only watch well-made movies. I don't watch a movie if it actually just looks like shit. But also, usually I say that to say, like, look,
I have to give it a compliment somewhere.
Well, I'm going to say, like, look, it's not going to scream at you that's poorly made as you're watching. It's not going to take you out of it. In fact, that's what makes it more treacherous. That if it is a well-produced, it's Paul Thomas Anderson. He makes good movies. But if it was just shitty propaganda, it wouldn't matter. We wouldn't even need to watch it, and it wouldn't make any money, and it would just disappear, and it would end up on Tubi or something. But
and then Gio would finally watch it.
Yeah, exactly. Apparently, there's a whole universe of really low-budget black movies on Tubi that I need to check out. But yeah, I'm saying it's well made. Saying like, look, you're gonna have a good time watching it. But that almost makes it worse because then you need to pay attention. Like that's why people are complaining about Gran Torino every single year. Here's the thing about Gran Torino: it's a really well directed movie, but that allows the message.
It's some really good propaganda.
Yeah, that's why it fucking works. Clint Eastwood's an amazing director and he's an amazing actor. That's why you care about it. If it was done by Tosh.0, it wouldn't fucking matter. Anyway, all right. So
that's a name I haven't heard about in fucking years. Yeah. Did Daniel Tosh ever get his high school romance? Did he ever succeed? You remember for 5 minutes when Dane Cook was funny?
Yeah. Then his head got big.
Then his head got big, and then he married someone like 20-something years his junior.
I guess it balances out.
He pulled the Cormac McCarthy, but made it okay because he's not dead yet.
Look, in death, you can do whatever you want. That's what people don't tell you when you're alive. It's it doesn't matter when you die. They're going to look back and say that was awesome. The history. If there's one thing I'll leave you with tonight, everyone, it's that history is very kind to maladaptive behaviors and insane actions.
Just look at Africa.
All right, I'll let you go. Godspeed.